Hello, and welcome to another conversation here at the Informed Perspective. If you're joining us for the first time, we're really glad you're here. Our mission is to reimagine what local community can look like while staying deeply connected to the global conversations that shape us. As our name suggests, we believe that change starts when we seek out and truly listen to diverse perspectives. And while our focus is often local, these dialogues can ripple outward to build empathy, insight, and meaningful connection wherever you are. In May, we dedicated our work at the Informed Perspective to loss and transition. As we explored this topic more deeply, we found ourselves moving beyond typical assumptions, which led us being drawn to the role of patient advocacy, particularly in the context of navigating a serious condition or diagnosis. When faced with such news, many individuals are thrust into emotional turmoil, and these emotions can sometimes cloud an individual's ability to approach medical appointments or treatment decisions with clarity. The shock, the fear, and confusion that follow can be overwhelming. Suddenly, you're expected to make critical decisions about treatment, often without enough time, support, or information. And that's where patient advocacy comes in. The American Medical Association defines patient advocacy as the act of promoting or supporting the interests, rights, and well-being of patients within the healthcare system. However, in practice, true patient advocacy extends into broader domains that affect patient health and well-being. In real-world practice, patient advocacy is holistic. It involves standing up for patients not only in clinics and hospitals, but also in courts, communities, and legislatures. Advocates help bridge the gap between fear and understanding. They stand beside patients, fighting for their right to be heard, fully informed and empowered to make decisions that reflect their values and not just their diagnosis. But what happens when doctors are unable or unwilling to support their patients adequately? When communication breaks down, when critical information is overlooked, or where care becomes impersonal or even negligent? Let's be honest. There are many incredible, talented, and compassionate medical professionals out there, but medical malpractice does happen. And when it does, it's not just a breach of care, it's a breach of trust. So what happens when the very people that we turn to for help end up causing us harm? And what recourse is available? What rights do patients really have in a system that can feel opaque, rushed, and at times more focused on procedure than on people? Patients, especially those living with chronic illness, rare conditions, or complex diagnoses, don't just battle their health, they can also encounter invisibility. Sometimes they find themselves repeating their stories again and again, hoping this time someone will hear them. They're told, potentially it's stress, or your lab works look fine, or worst of all, it's in your head. Being a patient can feel like shouting into the void. And this is why patient advocacy is not optional, it's essential. It's the voice that says, I know my body and I deserve to be believed. Patient advocates, whether individuals advocating for themselves or for others, are fighting not just for better treatment, but for recognition, respect, and representation in systems that too often diminish or dismiss their experiences. And yet for many, stepping into advocacy isn't easy. Shame, fear, exhaustion, or the deep scars left by medical gaslighting can make silence feel safer. But silence, like misdiagnosis, carries real risks. It can delay care, deepen harm, and leave people feeling even more alone and disempowered. And this is why patient advocacy matters. Advocates help patients navigate a system that often feels overwhelming. They ask the hard questions, amplify unheard voices, and guide people toward ethical, legal, and emotional support when things go wrong. And it doesn't stop with physical care. Patient data, deeply personal and sensitive, is another area where trust must be earned and protected. If a patient's information is misused, leaked, or withheld, the consequences could be just as harmful as a misdiagnosis. Advocates are pushing for transparency here too. Who has access to your medical records? How are decisions being made behind the scenes? And are your rights being upheld? Because informed consent isn't just a checkbox. It's a right, and patients deserve support, not just when things go well, but especially when they don't. So to get us rolling today on advocacy and patient advocacy, here are a few powerful quotes that capture maybe a little bit of the essence and urgency behind this. Alice Walker, the author of The Color Purple, once said, "The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any." Angela Davis, political activist and scholar, "I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept." Hillary Clinton reminds us that if you believe you can make a difference, you have to be prepared to accept that you are not going to get 100% approval. And Hannah Brencher, writer and mental health advocate, writes, "Maybe life isn't about avoiding the bruises. Maybe it's about collecting the scars to prove that we showed up for it." And Crystal Meadows, a patient advocate, "Doctors know a lot, but they don't know everything. Unfortunately, what your doctor doesn't know can definitely hurt you." And Neil Churchill, Director of Patient Experience at NHS England, "Patients are generally in the best position to know what good looks like. To deliver personalized healthcare, we have to put patients in control." So today we are joined by two remarkable women whose lived experiences have not only shaped their personal paths, but are now guiding and supporting others through some of life's most challenging moments. And I'm very excited to hear more. So Jenny, I will pass you over to do the introductions, please.
Thank you, Penny. Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting conversation today, and I can't wait to get started. So first up, we've got Christine von Raesfeld, a lived experience expert and citizen scientist focused on precision medicine, rare disease research, and AI rights in healthcare. She's especially renowned for her leadership in the rare and chronic disease community. She collaborates with organisations like the NIH, CNS Summit, and is board member of the Light Collective to ensure patients' voices guide research, policy, and technology. A co-author of the first patient-led framework for AI rights in healthcare, Christine promotes ethical data use and patient autonomy. She's also a published author and frequent speaker on patient empowerment, data equity, and healthcare innovation. And our next guest is Shona Dors, a communications director, mum of one, and breast cancer survivor, living in the Caribbean. Diagnosed during COVID in May 2021, Shona underwent a bilateral mastectomy, but her journey didn't end there. She endured 13 surgeries, sepsis, and continues with complex reconstruction today. What stands out in Shona's story is her emphasis on misplaced trust, specifically what happens when the trust we place in the medical professionals is broken. After being misled by a surgeon she believed in, she has become an advocate for medical transparency, patient autonomy, and the importance of being truly informed. There's some stories to be heard, so we'll pass back over to Penny for the questions.
Great. So we're going to start with Christine this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening. Christine, I mean, your story is incredible. You have been navigating serious health challenges basically your entire life. You had your first surgery when you were just 5 and diagnosed with a rare blood disorder at the age of 14. You faced a complex mix of rare genetic and autoimmune conditions. Also, along the way, you've had misdiagnoses, difficult treatments. I wanted to really ask you, what was it like growing up navigating all these illnesses? And do you feel along the way, that's an extra part to it, whether you had the support that you needed?
Okay, so I would say it's been a long journey, right? I started out, like you said, at 5 with just a mix of conditions. And getting sick as a kid, I think, is really difficult, right? I think that normal people, I just had this conversation with a friend of mine yesterday where he was diagnosed with what was it? MS, I'm sorry, but later in life, right? And it was devastating, and by all means should be when you get some kind of diagnoses like that. And my realization, and I was talking to him, I said that these diagnoses that I have over 40 now in my charts, but they don't hit me as hard, right? Dealing with illness from the time that I was a kid every new diagnosis is just kind of like, okay, it's just whatever at this point. I don't remember the dates and these milestone moments where I stopped treatments because nothing ever ended, right? When we solved for one thing, something else would pop up, and there were all of these issues. And I think as a kid, and I look pretty healthy, which is a big part of the issue. Um, I would go to doctors with my mom, and she would even be dismissed. And so there was really that big fight on trying to prove to people that I was sick. And I think at one point, I actually many points, I questioned my own sanity, right? When doctors are telling me that they can't find something wrong, but I'm feeling something, what do you do? And so I kept pushing. My mom kept pushing. We saw doctor after doctor. It wasn't until I'd say in my 40s, I'm almost 50. I'll be 50 next week. But one of the things that I kind of realized was even with the mental health issues and dealing with a chronic illness, my therapist would tell me, oh, well, I was diagnosed with chronic depression, which I think a lot of us are when we're dealing with conditions. And that idea that a lot of this was in my head. But in my 40s, I finally found a doctor who was able to tell me, all of these people telling you these things on your head, he said, I will validate that, yes, it is in your head, but not in the way that they are thinking of it. And so we uncovered a rare brain condition, which is autoimmune autonomic gangliopathy. And that was only because I kept pushing. And so I think the support I will say I had the support of my parents, right? But they were also parents. There were 4 other children in the household. My mom was an immigrant from the Philippines, so didn't really understand how the medical system in the US worked. There was some animosity, I think, between some of my brothers and sisters because it looked like I got special treatment. And then growing up as a kid, I felt like I had to hide all of this, right? I didn't want to admit it to my peers, and I didn't want to talk to people about it because it wasn't something they were dealing with. And so I think I was alone a lot of the time. And even though I did have that love and support from my parents, it wasn't the support that I see now available to parents and rare disease patients that we have today. And I really do feel like sometimes the lack of support actually caused me to become a bigger advocate for myself, right? Because I was seeing that I wasn't being supported in issues and then had to take that on by myself. And now I think I have found those communities of support, but it has only been in interacting and engaging with other people who have similar instances and similar stories who can relate to that part of life. And so I guess I'll leave it right there for now.
I'd be really curious. I mean, yeah, I mean, what a journey. And you say 40 diagnoses, and how many doctor's appointments there have probably been along that road, and different specialists, and possibly bouncing from one to the next, and tests and all the rest of it. I'm absolutely exhausting. I'm curious to know, at what point did you realize that your story would actually have leverage to help in patient advocacy? Or was there a turning point when you thought, I'm now gonna reach out and do more? Or how was that?
So I went on to permanent disability at the age of 27. And at that point, I kind of resigned myself to thinking I really didn't have a purpose, right? I was sick. I was going to have to be taken care of the rest of my life. And I kind of fell into that, right? I watched my nieces. I helped raise my nieces for 16 years. But at some point in my 30s, something clicked, right? And I told I told somebody at the time that I wanted to start talking about my story, and someone said, nobody's going to want to hear your story. You're sick. And so after hearing that, that was my motivation, right? From someone to tell me that all of this that I had been through wasn't valid and that it really didn't matter to other people. That really just, I guess, lit a fire under me and really just was like, no, there has to be a reason why I went through all of this. I'm not a hugely religious person. I was raised Catholic, but overall, I feel like we all have some kind of purpose, and there is something higher and something that we should be answering to. I'm not sure what that is, but I think it was really Oh gosh, I can't even think of where I'm going next. Did that
Yeah.
answer some of it?
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And I think it's so important, whatever we're talking about. And we've been doing, we did a podcast this week on inclusivity. And I think a really important part of the whole story thing is telling your story. And as a patient, you're not just that number, or you're not just the person who's suffering from X or whatever. That it's actually when you do tell your story and you bring out the humanity and all the emotions and the feelings that come along with it, maybe then that's when people really think, oh, okay, now I get it, right?
Yeah.
And that's
Can I
where
tell
the
you?
power is.
Can I tell you a quick story? Years ago in 2019, I was nominated for an award in Silicon Valley, and it was the Silicon Valley Business Journal Women of Influence. And it was 100 women in the Bay Area, and Silicon Valley has some amazing women. And my congressman's staff had nominated me for the award. And I struggled with the fact that I was even nominated, right? I didn't know why. What did I do? I'm a patient. I don't have kids. I don't have a college degree. And they said, no, you were important. And so I had nothing planned, right? And I'm listening. There's 100 of us women. We each get 1 minute on the stage. And these women are coming up saying they graduated from college. They started this company. They've done these phenomenal things. And I'm sitting there waiting for my turn to get up. I had nothing planned to speak. And I was like, what am I going to say? And so when I finally got up there, it just all kind of clicked. And I got up and I said, the whole theme was first. What was the first that you had done that is going to encourage other people after you? And I said, I don't really have a first. I didn't go to college. I didn't get a family. I didn't start a company. I said, but I am the first woman on this or within this award to be nominated who's on disability. And so I said that I wanted my place in this to be able to show people who felt like they were a burden or felt like they were invisible, that they had a voice and that they mattered to people. And I got a standing ovation, which was not done with anyone else, which was kind of phenomenal for me. But really that thought, right? I think a lot of us going through illness, because there is such a stigma around illness, and because we fall into this role where other people have to be there to take care of us, that mindset sets in early. And it sets in that you're a burden and you're not worth anything. And I think that that's wrong, right? I think we have these amazing opportunities and experiences that can really help our whole industry and other people. I think I tell people my one strong suit and my superpower is that because I've been through so much and so many different diagnoses, there's a part of my story that relates to everyone. And when I get to talk to people one-on-one and they share things with me and I can validate their thoughts or share some of mine, I think it just becomes powerful. And I think we have to realize as patients that we are not that stigma. We are not that, that bothersome thing. We're not a number in a study. We are our people. And these experiences have happened to us because we can deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also that sort of yeah, you kind of grow up sort of thinking you'll never get ill, and as you age, you do start to realize your own mortality. And then these conversations, even then, I mean, when you tell me you were a child and you had to face all that, I can't imagine that. But as a child, normally, if you're fit and well, you don't spare a second thinking about mortality, right? Not for a moment. And I think as you get older, it's important to start thinking about these things. And the point that we can all get ill any day, any moment, like we're all in essence hanging from a very tiny little thread all the time. And we're busy with success and life and whatever else we're doing, but actually that can be cut any moment, right? And that to have that humility and to have awareness around that, I think that's really, really important as well. What I wanted to ask you, Christine, was about this pharmacogenomic testing that you've been doing, which is quite exciting. So this is testing that can be, so tell me a bit more about it, testing that it ultimately finds out what medication you can and can't take, or is there more to this?
So there's a little bit more to that because we haven't built up a database yet to cover every drug that's out there. But a pharmacogenomics test is really just a study of how your body breaks down certain compounds, right? So whatever that drug is built of, how your body reacts to that is different in every single one of us. And I was first exposed to pharmacogenomics through a study at Stanford. And somebody had told me about it and said, this might be helpful. And so one of the things we learned in that test, after we had taken this test, I had all of these different reactions to different compounds, right? I was fast metabolizer on some and slow metabolizer on another. But I had been having issues, more severe joint pains, more issues with cognitive thinking and just my brain, right? And then vision issues. And all of those things, as I was going through all of my care, were being attributed to progression of my disease. And that's what all of the doctors were telling me. Oh, you have lupus, you have arthritis, you have this. And these could explain away the symptoms that I was feeling. But through the pharmacogenomics test, we were actually able to find out that all of these issues were not my condition. And what it ended up was the medications we were using to treat the symptoms of my disease were actually causing more damage than the disease itself. And so I ended up with 3 joint replacements, soon to be 5, because my hips also have to go. I have toxic encephalopathy. So if you don't know what that is, that's permanent brain damage. And I also lost my night vision and accelerated macular degeneration, all from standard of care drugs. But I am half Asian, which I think is a factor that we don't think about, right? Most of the drugs that we have produced historically have been produced off of white males. Yep. And so we're not factoring in women, we're not factoring other nationalities or ethnicities and how that really plays into it. And I think there's also a level of the environmental factors, right? There's so many things that influence our health that we're not thinking about. But this test was just a phenomenal learning point for me. And I was never interested in science as a kid, right? I just looked at it all. I was not a good student. I'm more an active learner, if you want to call it that. But when I finally found something where here was something that could actually change my care, that's when I became fascinated, right? That's when I started diving in and really becoming curious. And so I testified with the California State Assembly a few years ago. We actually got pharmacogenomics approved for all of our Medi-Cal patients. So anyone who had experienced a side effect from a medication would now be eligible for this test. And UCSF is another hospital here in California where they are building their own database on that. So any patient who has an adverse reaction, Medi-Cal or not, will get testing through UCSF. And so I think it's an important test. We also see with that test, there's an MTHR gene. I won't say what I call it normally because it's not appropriate. But we found evidence that if you are taking tamoxifen and you have that MTHR, that could cause death. And so really looking at how these drugs interact with people, I think is especially important. And I urge everyone that I speak to that if you are experiencing adverse effects or side effects from a medication, to bring it up to their doctors, to report this to their physicians, and then to ask for this test. Maybe it's not available, maybe it is, but it never hurts to ask.
It's huge. I've been also talking to quite a lot of war veterans who took the anti-malarial drug mefloquine, aka Lariam, and that is also fascinating because it sounds like, I mean, they were prescribed it, there wasn't an option, off you go, and you had to take it. And it kind of sounds like in that case there are certain people who just cannot tolerate these drugs at all. And if there was potentially a way before you took that first pill just to say, nah,
Yep.
you're not taking this ever in your life because this is not a good idea. And the side effects will have been absolutely tragic. And it's been suicide, all kinds of things. That would be an absolute game changer. So I guess we're talking about making the healthcare more personalized then, trying in the future sort of say, you know, this is you and you don't just take that particular box of medication and off you run. We actually look at, you know, who we're dealing with rather than just a group, right?
Yeah, and I'll comment too that you can react differently to different drugs, right? So if you're a slow metabolizer, what I learned was basically your body is keeping that drug in your system. So it's allowing it to double and triple in dose, which is what caused one of the drugs to be able to cross my blood-brain barrier. But if we look at things like opioids, those are not effective from me. So pain management has also been extremely difficult because the drugs that we have now aren't effective. I will say cognitive behavioral therapy was a lifesaver as I got older and really, really did try to, it really reshaped my brain, right?
And it's so fascinating in, you know, how you speak and what you've been through, Christine, when you know, the determination was there from such a young age, you know, powered, you know, by your family as well. But, you know, that there was, you weren't well and there needed to be answers and you carried on. And, you know, I guess there were times, you know, you mentioned in your, you know, 20s and you know you stopped a little bit, but actually it's what I think so inspiring is like even if you're ill and unwell, like you, as you said, your purpose, like what is it that really matters to you and like how do you want to take that forward? And you know, that's not saying that's easy to do, but that it's okay to, we've touched on the busyness as well, and but it's okay to stop and be ill and look after yourself, but actually, you know, how do you want to take that forward? And then that determination carried on when, you know, spurred by, you know, who will want to hear your story, but you're like, actually this is how I can help and I can share my story so other people might not feel so lonely. So it's, you know, across it all, that determination. And you also rounded it off so beautifully by that curiosity now in this. I think when I was hearing you talk about, you know, personalized treatment and understanding how, you know, medicines can, you know, the compounds and how different people can react, we've got to be inwardly curious as well, like who actually sits down and reads the side effects. And if you are feeling a certain way after taking some medication, you can so easily, oh, that's the side effects of it. But is it like, you know, have you checked? And is it, and what else could it be? Or I don't want to feel like this. Is there any other options? And I think this, the advocacy empowerment as well, is for people to know that you are the most important person and you've got to figure out what's best, what's going on with you and what's best for you going forward. And I think that's, you know, obviously there's all the scientific testing and, you know, knowledge, but actually we know ourselves, you know, as much. And some of the quotes that Penny shared at the top of the podcast, you know, we need to go forward and know how we want to live our lives and how we might be feeling or our bodies are reacting. So it's really, really inspiring.
Christine, I wanted to
I
ask.
also,
So,
oh, go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I'm going to go off on another tangent, so I'm giving you a moment to jump in.
Well, I was just gonna say too, working with my doctors, I don't have any ill will to any of my doctors, right? I will say that as a kid, my doctor, she was it was a strained relationship when I was young. She was an Indian woman who was very direct and very curt, right? And not very personal. And I actually always thought that she hated me. And when she retired at 20, I was 27 years old when she retired. And I went in and her whole staff, right? The nurses loved me. Christine's the kid that came in. She was an oncologist hematologist, so mostly older patients. And here was this young kid that's kind of like this bull in a china shop. But she gave me a hug. And it was the first time in my life, right? 14 to 28. She had never shown any affection at all. And at her retirement, she gave me a hug and she said, I think of you as my daughter. And I started crying because I said, you think of me as your daughter? I thought you hated me. And she's like, no, but I need to get things done. right? And so even just kind of this cultural kind of cross between me and my doctor, she was businesslike, right? Because she knew in this whole industry that's in the hospital system, that's how she had to work to get things done. And so I think as I've gotten older, I've gotten to see the perspectives of the other people, right? I did an interview with my parents where my dad always felt like there were certain times of my life where he felt like I hated him. And I didn't. I was on steroids. And I think if you know anyone who's been on steroids, there are some rage issues if you metabolize that differently. And so getting to see these perspectives, right? My mom is an immigrant. My siblings as people that were kind of ignored in my whole treatment and my life, in our lives growing up, my doctors and the nurses, right? And really kind of being able to put those together from a very, just a weird bird's eye view now has been really fascinating. I will say I was angry for a long time when I first got into advocacy because I got into the rare disease space and I saw these amazing parents, right? Parents who were traveling everywhere. We were doing everything for their kids. And I just kept thinking, mine didn't do this, and there was this sense of animosity, I think, towards them on like, why didn't you do these things? How did you not know that I needed these? My dad, at one point in the interview that we did, we were talking about there, or actually before the interview that we did, and I had said, I'm reading through my medical notes as a kid, and it says we need family therapy. Like we never had it. And he was like, well, I was at work. I didn't know that this was even being talked about. And so I think there was a lot in my own head, right, that I just kind of had to be at peace with, to understand the other parts of this, that it wasn't just me or about me. There were all these other individuals who were impacted in very different ways by me being sick. But that also didn't come till, my 40s to have those realizations.
But I feel like there's still something crucially wrong when doctors don't have the time or the permission to show a bit of empathy to their patients. And I'm not saying that they're at fault for it, because that can be the system, that can be whatever, the pressures that they're under. But as a patient, the one thing when you're really, up against it is just a bit of compassion. And I'm sorry, but like for me personally, I've had experiences with doctors who showed the empathy of a rock. And at times when all I just needed was to have some humanity shown to me and not to be treated like whatever. And I think we mustn't, that's for me as a patient, when I think of patient the most important is the person at the heart of it, because patients need it more than anybody.
Oh yeah. And I will say now I have found an amazing coordinated care team. At Stanford, they have a program for complex and complicated patients where they actually have a whole team that's assigned to you. And I will say that that team has been a game changer in my life, right? I'm no longer now dealing with 18 different specialists and trying to get them to talk to each other. I have someone that's fighting for me. And I think that is extremely important as well, right? To find that physician that you relate to that has your back, and mine has been phenomenal. I'm still undiagnosed and we're looking for those answers. And my doctor has been more than happy to bring in other analysis from different people that I've brought in. And at some point, we are going to meet together for a clinical translation session so that we can bring all this data that doesn't make sense and see how we can implement it into clinical care.
Incredible. So you were also talking a lot about like data equity and how patients' data can be used and how we protect it. What can we potentially do as individuals to support this movement of getting ownership over our data?
So I think first is to educate yourself. I think that we tend to just kind of hop onto the bandwagon, right, of the people that we trust or the people that we like, and sometimes that may not be the right information. And so really doing your research, finding people in spaces to have these discussions with, listening into conversations. Before we got on here, we talked about really how we have to listen, right? We've gotten to a weird space where politics have kind of overtaken everything. And I think we need to take a step back, listen, look at the data, and really educate yourself around the data. We're moving into a space of AI, which is a really fascinating and could be potentially hopeful for a lot of us that are dealing with rare conditions. But I think the way that AI is being used is also not inclusive of all of us. And sorry. And I think that especially as a rare disease patient, I'm afraid of some of these technologies and algorithms that are based on a general population when I'm so different. And so I think when it comes to your data, really being aware of the issues that are out there, looking at consents when you're signing for consents and seeing what you're really signing into. Sometimes that's difficult, but always ask questions. I work with the Light Collective. So if you want some more education there, we have a website with different blog posts that are easy to understand at lightcollective.org. And really, I think really it's just the education around it, right?
Yeah,
And knowing that the data does impact.
yeah, because I think there is a fear, isn't there, when you're kind of asked, do you want to give your data or whatever? There's a tendency to go, well, actually, no, I don't want to. But actually, what you're advocating for is yes, but under
Yes,
certain conditions.
I love that. Because I do think I think if we ever want to get to a state of personalized or precision medicine, we are going to need more data. And if people start pulling out of research and studies and stop sharing their data, that puts us at a halt. And so how do we encourage people to be able to participate and still have, some sort of say in what's going on? And I think the system overall is really looking at incentives and how we co-create and co-design with patients from the very beginning. And so, sorry. So I would say for everyone out there is really get involved, right? Start looking at what's going on. Find out why this is important to you, because even though we may think it isn't, I always tell people data when I start to talk to people, because it's not something tangible, it just goes over their head. And so I like to equate the data conversation to the music industry. So if you think about your medical data as your song, right? We know that thousands of people or hundreds of people are needed to produce a song or to put out a CD or whatever is put out now. But it's that combination, but we never lose sight of the artist. And that's where I think things lie. And I think there's also some confusion, right? We talk about de-identified data, but I think it's also important to know that if you have any weird biomarkers or different traits, you are re-identifiable. And my push is to not sever a patient or not cut a person off completely from their data, to still be able to communicate to them when science or innovation brings new insights or results, to be able to get back to them.
And get involved in research trials or whatever else you can do, right? There's lots of stuff going on where potentially anyone
And
can.
the benefits too, right? I mean, you may not get a financial benefit all the time from participating in things, but I've gotten resources for cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm about to start a fitness program with a trainer at Stanford in a cardiac fit program, right? And so I think looking at them, the pharmacogenomics test was a benefit to a study, and I wouldn't have gotten that information or that knowledge without participating. So looking at these things as opportunities for you, right? That can help you just live better.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Right, I'm going to move on now to Shona. But just before we dive in, I just wanted to remind ourselves of a few facts that are relevant now to our next conversation. So in the US, breast cancer is the second most common cancer among women and also the second leading cause of cancer deaths. In the UK, it remains the most common cancer overall and is one of the top causes of death for women under 50. According to the World Health Organization, breast cancer cases currently number around 2.3 million new diagnoses annually and are expected to rise by 38% by 2050, reaching approximately 3.2 million cases each year. We're seeing more diagnoses, more surgeries, more recoveries, and more women having to navigate this really complex treatment journey. Shona, you said your story isn't necessarily about the cancer, it's about misplaced trust. Can you walk us through what happened in your journey with your surgeon and how that experience has changed your perspective?
Of course. So yes, most of it had begun before the cancer. I'd always had some difficulties and lumps and what have you in my breast that had been looked into, and then over COVID there was a few things that were getting more worrying, and the waiting part is of course always very difficult, and because of where we were living at the time, we had to try and leave a very locked down island to get to the US to get more answers, and that's where my diagnosis happened. Mine wasn't a particularly straightforward diagnosis. I was very lucky that it was early, but I had to make some very difficult decisions, and mine wasn't a cancer that was going to be able to be treated with chemo. It was going to be radiation or a bilateral mastectomy. And it was one of the interesting things, and I'll touch on that again later on, but at the time, the advice that we were getting was to absolutely go with the radiation, and it wasn't sitting well with me, so we had been looking at some other options. What kind of surgery is involved? What kind of reconstruction is possible? Where could it be done? Who could do it? And eventually settled, having then spoken to another oncologist outside of my original team who'd made the excellent point that I was still relatively young, and from where the radiation would have to happen and the duration of it, the chances of me developing a secondary cancer in the next 10 years were incredibly high. And the reality was, in the event, even with the radiation, there was so many question marks over where else this cancer could pop up that realistically having the bilateral mastectomy was going to be one of the ways to help mitigate things in the future. And so there was a lot of consultation. We did our research, we asked other people, tried to document as much as we could at the time, but it is a tricky thing when you are facing making ultimately life-changing decisions, and you're doing it at the time for us during COVID, incredibly difficult, very small support network system. But the decision was made, the surgery happened, and at the time, mine was one where there was an immediate reconstruction. So you go to sleep and you wake up and it's ostensibly the same, and of course, absolutely not. But from a mental perspective, there was something there, and then things went downhill relatively quickly. We'd had some issues already beforehand in the run up to the actual big surgery. Then there were more issues, infection, sepsis, going into hospital, having to fight pretty hard to stay around, and ultimately losing that first reconstruction, which was something that was quite brutal from how you, as a person that's already been through so much in a short period of time, your outcome, because it's done in a rush, it's not planned, it's actually from a physical recovery and a mental recovery, a very different road to the one that you've already been on, alongside having the concern of, did they get all the cancer? Was it all sorted? And so that's why I say that the story isn't about the cancer diagnosis, it's about what happened afterwards. And I had to have some time for my body to heal, and decided that we would try and have another reconstruction, staying with the same surgeon but moving hospitals and countries, because I was very lucky to be able to try and do that with the insurance I had, and things started going quite literally south again. One of my implants ended up heading at a rapid rate towards my abdomen. And then we came back and more surgeries, more adjustments, one in particular where action was taken during the surgery that I was completely unaware of, hadn't been discussed beforehand. And at that point, when you've trusted somebody so implicitly, and I just had already had this niggling feeling that things just really were not going the way they should do. The reality was I should have been a pretty, in inverted commas, simple case. I was relatively young, relatively fit, relatively healthy outside the diagnosis. This should not be as difficult as it is. I had voiced some of my concerns, I was dismissed, and then I started on a voyage to be my own advocate, find out what was going on, realizing that these things weren't the way it should be. Finally found a fantastic surgical team whom I went to go and see, and who said, yeah, this is absolutely not how it should be, and have been working with them for the last year and a half now to try and make the most of what is there. The big part of it is, for me, being able to speak to other patients, whether it's newly diagnosed with cancer and looking at surgery or any other surgeries, knowing that it's okay to ask for another opinion. It's okay to ask more questions. You're not being a difficult patient. You have a right to say, okay, so if we're talking about these surgeries, what are the other outcomes? And how many times, what's your average rate of infection with patients? What happens in this? If I don't choose a surgery, what are the ramifications down the line? Can I see some photographs of other people's, if it's something that's an option? All of those parts, and having, making notes and being able to ask for your data as you go through the system with all the people that you're seeing, so that you are making as informed a decision as you can with the information you have at the time, which, when you're doing so in a space of emotional turmoil and physical discomfort, is incredibly challenging. And how can people think about those kind of questions, or how one would behave in that situation ahead of time? Because whether it's yourself or a family member or somebody in your community, there's going to be a time when people need to be able to feel safe, and having thought through the fact that if I'm not sure about this, I can ask, and here are the types of things I can ask, and how I can stand up for myself if I think things aren't going the right way.
And it seems like it was the unexpected, right? That was the worst part, that you sort of prepared yourself, but it was then what happened that you hadn't been anticipating. But my question is, psychologically, as when you're a patient, is it good to know all the possible outcomes that potentially could happen? Because that's also a psychological thing. I know, like, I lived in South Korea for a while, and the doctors would always tell you straight out the gate, I don't know if it's lost in translation, be like, yeah, you could die. Like, straight out, this is the worst case scenario. Like, no, I really didn't want to know that. That's the worst case scenario. But I'm not making a joke of this, I'm not playing it down, but that is also a big part. How do you approach an intervention with the right mindset when there are potentially all kinds of avenues that could crop up? And I wonder, that's where the doctors are potentially safeguarding themselves by then not mentioning it.
Of course they are. And when you're looking especially with a cancer diagnosis, there is, there's always a saying that if you know one person with breast cancer, you know one person. Everybody has, there are so many very different diagnoses, and my sister had breast cancer. Her diagnosis, her treatment plan, completely different from mine. The same with so many women in my community. And doctors are, from the most part, and in my experience, very good about giving you enough information at each stage. They do not want to overwhelm you with absolutely everything. That would be too much for most patients, and in different countries it's done in different ways. The important thing is that as you kind of reach each part of a process, is knowing that you've asked as many questions as you think might come up for that side of things, and documenting what you're being told at the time, and whether that's having somebody there with you or saying, listen, I'd like to try and record this, because in the moment when you're being told things, it can be so overwhelming. No one has going to have the ability to ask all the questions of all the things that might go wrong. It's more the case of understanding what was said at the time, what was agreed, having those brief notes. If you've got somebody with you, sometimes they can ask other questions, or even just being, you know, almost a secretary for you to be able to keep those notes handy. And after each appointment, asking for your follow-ups, making sure that you have, this is what's been agreed, here's how we're going to go forward, because the world gets busy, people get overwhelmed, whether it's the patient or the doctor. And especially in cases where you're going in and out of hospitals, in and out of surgeries, in and out of specialists, all these different places, to be able to have almost a playbook of as these things happen. It doesn't need to be overwhelming and feel like a lot. It just means that you're keeping track of what's been said when, and that's going to help you make decisions going forward.
And it's that confidence that people, maybe confidence isn't the right word, but like, you know, do take notes, do ask if you can have it recorded, because you need that information, and you often will need time to reflect on it and go back to it. Like when my mum was receiving diagnosis and treatment, subsequent treatment, I mean, we didn't laugh, but my dad would like go in with his big lever arch file, and everything was documented, and he would check every medication. And sometimes there was mistakes, because people are human, mistakes happen. And if it was, you know, and he was able to do that, you know, he wasn't working, he was you know, mentally and physically able to help in that way. But you look at some, we touched on accessibility really lightly, but Christine, with, you know, her mum and navigating the medical system as an immigrant and not really understanding. But, you know, you also need to have, I think people a lot of the time, that burden, what if I had another question? How do you get through to the doctor? And it's empowering people with the confidence to have that open communication and be like, I am here with my notes or my recorder, and you might get an email coming again, or I will, it might, you know, I'm saying about my dad because he's pretty avid, but it's actually remarkable. You know, he will ring the receptionist, and because he established that open communication and those relationships, he got through. Like they would give him appointments. But I think a lot of people feel, you know, that they don't have the right to, but exactly to the point, Shona, they absolutely fundamentally it is their right to.
It is, and it's a case of, and you know, I will reiterate this, it's not a case of being difficult, it's a case of asking the questions. And whatever part of the world you live in, whatever healthcare system you're in, getting in to see the right doctor at the right time is a challenge enough on its own. And whether we're doing it for, you know, our parents or our children, whatever is, you know, is it a medical appointment, is it a surgical consultation, you only have so much time, and you want to try, and there's a pressure to use that time wisely. Doctors are, of course, you know, incredibly busy people, and we know that. We've been brought up with that. We all grew up in a world where you don't question the doctor, you get in to see the doctor, you get told what's wrong with you, and out you go. And it's something where now it's still respecting medical healthcare professionals' time. It's just making sure that you're making the most of it for you with the time that you have with them, so that I'm sure everybody's been there at one point. You've left somewhere and gone, oh, I didn't ask that, I forgot to say this, whatever it was. You can go back and have those notes and then follow up. And it's okay to ask those questions. You might not get it immediately, but it's something where you have the right to ask, and it could help you in the future with whatever decisions you're going to need to make. So that it is, you know your body best. You're not there questioning people. You're just there making sure that you as a patient feel that you've had as much opportunity to gather the information that you can. And if you end up in a situation where you're not quite sure, that's okay. But that means that if you're able to speak to another professional, you can say, well, listen, here's what this situation was. What are your thoughts? And what would you suggest? because you kind of have those notes and you have that knowledge from being prepared going into the time that you have with the healthcare professionals.
And equally, like a medical professional ought to also accept that need, if you do want to get another opinion, second, third opinion, to say, yes, there are potentially different therapies, possibilities for you, and it's your decision then to look at what there is and then make that decision, right? There should be more. I feel like there's sort of a bit of stigma around, I'm going to go and get another opinion. Kind of feel like you're saying to your doctor, I don't respect your opinion, but it needn't be that. It's just you informing yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had that in the States. The team that I had been assigned with, my surgeon that was there, who was, she was fantastic. And at the time, it wasn't an option to go and have further surgery with her because of the COVID situation. But I was assigned an oncologist who wasn't immediately available. We had to wait some time to be able to speak to that person. So in the interim, we asked if we could speak to another oncologist. And they said, well, that's fine, but your other oncologist might not have you back. And that was the first time I'd heard such a thing. I was a bit surprised. It's not something I'd encountered in the healthcare system before. And I said, well, surely if they've got a differing opinion about treatment, then that's interesting and should be explored. But that's a different side of it. But the severity of what people are dealing with at any given point, it's so helpful. And I think this is the other part, that when you are advocating for yourself, if you do need to go and speak to other experts, if there are other parts that have been unlocked where you go, well, this is another option for a different type of treatment, you can turn up with not necessarily a giant book, but when I was diagnosed, I was handed a giant folder that I then populated, to be able to keep track of those things and feel that people aren't always going to be able to make the best decisions at the time. All they can feel is that they've made the best decision with all the information that they had and go forward from there. Nobody wants to have a situation where you are going on Dr. Google and researching all of these different things. You have to be guided by the medical community, but being able to ask the questions and have the confidence to advocate for yourself when you start to feel that something's not right, that is a very important part of understanding that it's not offending the medical community, it's looking out for yourself.
And I also feel it's really valuable for somebody who's a patient, whatever it might be, to potentially have information available from other patients that can be shared. This is a good doctor. This is someone who I've seen. This is a potential. That's really valuable. You were saying Google isn't the answer, but having sort of personal stories and knowing from other people what potentially has worked for them. I think if I was looking for a second opinion, I think I would feel much more comfortable sort of asking around and sort of saying, does somebody know a specialist in this area, than just blindly diving into the internet. And then actually that's quite frightening, because there can potentially be such a huge choice, right? They don't even know what they're doing.
Well, it is, and it's one of the reasons and one of the ways that I found the surgical team that I have got now. And it is the idea of being empowered as a patient and being able to speak to other people. And as Christine has touched on, being able to share your stories and the different emotional layers from it. And it's people who've been through difficult parts. You've got grief, you've got rage, fear, exhaustion when you've had so many surgeries back to back, all of those sides of bits. But when you've been through the ringer, there is always going to be lessons that are going to be able to help others in a similar situation, or perhaps even a slightly different situation. But it's being able to communicate with those and feeling more comfortable as a community to have those conversations open and honestly, so that ultimately somebody else can try and avoid that kind of trauma.
I'd like to ask actually both of you really, but I'll start with you, Shona. When you've had such a long journey, that obviously not as long as Christine's, but you've had your own journey that you've had to travel, and you have to keep finding the resilience and the power and the energy above all. Like I know this on a mini microscopic level, but they're just going to the doctors and time and again and having that second, third opinion and having the tests and all of this stuff. And then you've got your life going on as well. And your life just becomes a medical thing, and there's, you know, it's all consuming, and you can't even get your mind out of it at times because it's just always there. And yeah, that feels like so all consuming. So how do you find ways to sort of find the strength to push on through? Because I know, you know, with a cancer diagnosis as well, it's always an open option, right? That's a conversation that is going to continue.
For me, to touch on your point of it's an open conversation that's going to continue. It is always going to continue, and I think for me it was speaking to other patients, some of whom had also had some bad surgical outcomes, tied in with obviously a cancer diagnosis, where the upshot realistically is that I had to change my mindset from this is going to end to this is the end of this chapter, and this is now part of who I am and part of my story. And there are the days when you feel like it's all too much and you can't just keep doing this, but it's the fact that you get to be here and you do get to keep doing this, and that's got to drive you through, and it's taking everything one day at a time. And it was, for me, I had a bracelet that one of my best friends had given me before I'd gone off for one of my surgeries, and it just had written inside it, just keep bleeping going. And that for me was one of the things that I kept looking at and going, yeah, that is where I need to find strength, not for me, but for everybody else in my life. I had a young daughter. That was a huge part of also physically wanting to get myself back up and back on my feet as fast as possible for her sake, and not wanting to burden my other half with any more than I had already done, which again, very difficult, and we could only have a very few number of people around us for parts of it. But knowing that there is going to be a path forward, that's a story that not everybody gets to have, and it's not that that needs to serve as a constant reminder, but it is something that when perspective is needed, it's helpful. And being able to get outside, that was one of my big things when things were bad, was as long as I could just get outside and get fresh air, be reminded, speak to friends, take the support that's offered, because you can just, sometimes I have perhaps been accused in the past of just getting on with things and not sharing when things got hard, and everybody would come and go, oh God, you're dealing with it so well. And I'm thinking, oh, you have not seen me on the bathroom floor in floods of tears, trying to sort myself out before my little girl walks through the door. But thanks. And people offered, people would say, you know, lean on us, let us help. And for the longest time, I felt really guilty asking. But the reality was, anytime somebody asks me for help, I am honoured and more than delighted to give it, whatever the situation is. And it took some stern words from my sister to say, you know, you are not required to be Superwoman every single day. You can let other people wear that cape. And I went, right, yes, good point. And so when somebody said, you know, can I do X? I went, that would be really nice. And they went, yay, finally, she said yes to something. So that was the leaning on other people and allowing them to help outside of my, you know, immediate family, who were fantastic. It's letting your village be there for you, because that doesn't stop you being incredibly strong. That makes you even stronger.
So admirable though, how you know, you take it and you turn it around and you see the best of whatever it is and push on through. And I just you know, I'm in awe of you. I'm in awe of both of you, because I haven't even had anything on the level that you've had, and it was already enough. I know being in hospitals and just wanting to get out of just thinking the freedom of being outside the hospital, that just being stuck inside a hospital, not being able to go out onto the streets, just the thought of going out to have a coffee and having that freedom. Every day we live our lives, we don't think once about the freedom that our bodies enable us, allow us to do when they work how they should, right?
Sorry, I was just about asking for help as well. I think you know, hearing you speak, Shona, it's like actually like how can you inspire people to ask for help, and it might be like, help me understand this better, or can I just actually talk to you about what the doctor told me, you know, like that you know, can you ask someone to advocate for you, you know, because I'd love our listeners now, you know, if or should they ever go through something where they need to understand more and they need to advocate for themselves, like actually you don't have to do that by yourself. Like you know, we've got people around us, like use them. If it's your partner or your parents or your sister or your friends, and just as you were speaking, I was like, there's so many ways that just
Can't do it by
asking for
yourself.
help, you know, even just like the receptionist at the, you know, say at the doctor's, actually, could you help me, I've just been given this, you know, like it's those little sort of steps that we don't have all the answers, definitely, or the ability always to do everything.
It's a part of it is being actually brave enough to ask for help. And so when I was first diagnosed, I wasn't allowed to have anyone with me for anything. So my husband was allowed to come to the very first appointment, and then he was not allowed to come to anything. So I was diagnosed on my own. I had quite a few of my surgeries on my own. I had all the other varying fun appointments that you are going through during that process, and that was ahead of the big mastectomy, but that was all of it on my own because I couldn't have anybody there. And so that when it came to later down the line, I was almost already conditioned to doing it on my own, that, you know, if my husband wasn't available, I'd say, well, it's fine, I'll go on my own. Well, I didn't have to. And I had a friend turn up and say, I'm here, and I'm just going to come with you, even if it's just to sit in the back of the room. And I said, no, it's fine, I don't want to inconvenience you. And it was after that I realized actually the ability to say, yes, please come with me, that would be great. And I'd far rather be able to have, and it's a shared experience, it's someone that's there, it's someone to support you. Don't try and be a hero and go it alone when you don't need to.
Christine, I wanted to put that to you as well, really. How have you found the strength? What do you find works for you when you know this journey is ongoing and you have to keep finding the energy and the resilience to keep pushing on through?
So I would say that I relate a lot to your story. I think for me, one of the biggest things that I learned over my lifetime was really how to disassociate myself from the disease and the things that I was going through, right? I think that was important and crucial for me, right, as a kid, to be just bombarded with one thing after another and diagnoses and symptoms. And I did have to, at some point, just compartmentalize, right? And now I think I speak about my illnesses like they're not mine now, right? Which is great, but also not great, because then people don't think it affects me as much because I can be so stoic about it. I think pride is a nasty beast at some points, and we don't want to ask for that help. But we do need to, right? And I echo the thought that I used to really struggle and still struggle with asking for help from other people. And I've recently had my friends tell me, you are not here to save the world. You just need to survive yourself. And that kind of keeps hitting home. My whole life got inundated in medical and disease and still is, right? I never got married. Partial was Medicare also has limitations on what people can do. And so never found that support in that way. I think though, again, the communities, the people I've met who've experienced similar situations, my normie friends, I call them normies, those are my friends that don't deal with anything. They've gotten a little better, but I've learned to realize that they aren't the people that I go to for certain things, right? So knowing who your friends are and what the people in your life, what the purpose of the people in your life is. And so those that are there for just to entertain you, to keep your mind off of things, those aren't the ones that you want to drag into all of these discussions. And then I think the other thing that really helps me survive is I've set limits on myself. I have clinical depression, and I know for a fact that if I were to sit in bed, I can do 2 days max. If I stay in bed for longer, that 2 days turns into 2 weeks or 2 months. And so really, really like Shona said, just taking myself out there, making sure I get outside, even though it's just sit outside in the backyard, right? But to feel sunlight on my skin and to put my feet in the grass and just ground myself again. I think as advocates, we're all struggling, right? We're burnt out. The focus isn't always on us and we're constantly fighting. And I think there has to be a balance. And I haven't at almost 50 come to that balance quite yet, but I'm working on it every day.
So last question before we move to our tween question. I wanted to ask both of you really, what kind of changes would you both like to see in the healthcare system in the next 5 to 10 years, particularly regarding patient advocacy? One wish that you might have.
I know mine. Do you want me to start, Shona?
Do yours first. I'm curious. I have an I have an AI question that I'm wondering if that might be something that can help. I'm very interested to hear yours first, Christine.
So what my thought is, what I'd like to see if I had a blue sky, could do whatever I would wanted, I would look at publicly funded research to return the data back to individual patients who then would be able to appoint an agent or a nonprofit group or even an AI agent, right? That could then go out there and find opportunities. I think the proprietary aspect of how our data is owned by either medical institutions or companies that produce these tests for us, I think is really just kind of lacking on that overall responsibility. And I think for us as patients to really get anywhere, we need access to that data. We need to be able to share that data freely with other people. We need it not locked up in one company and waiting for them to give us results. I think that's where, and I think the CF community showed that a few years ago, right? Really rallying together, bringing in researchers, and then working with a pharmaceutical company to produce a drug that actually worked for their community. And so that's what my hope would be. And that's why I think the data part of this is extremely important. If we realize how much power is in that data and that individually our data may not be worth much, but as a group combined, that is huge to research, to medical, to innovation. And if we could find a way that that balances out and that incentive then flows across all of our stakeholders, I think we have a better chance to move forward. If I, as a rare disease patient and where I'm at, if I were to wait for the system to find me answers, I would never get them and I wouldn't be as far as I am.
But it seems like you're excited as well for the potential that is there if we get it right.
Hugely excited for the potential. If it works, then we can do this right, because I do see benefits, right? I lived on the Medicare system where I had to live under the federal poverty line while I was receiving care. But then seeing the other industry side of this where profits are being made and me being forced to live in this state and having to consent to all of these things just to live. And I've often said that consent at the point of care is coercion oftentimes. And so how do we really build a system where patients are co-creating, co-designing, and sharing in the incentives?
And Shona, to you.
I think that from my perspective, my biggest wish is that it would become commonplace and standardization for patients to receive follow-up information after their appointments. And this is a very interesting one because whatever happens with AI in healthcare, and it will, because that's an inevitability, if it can be done properly and patients have the trust aspect that their data and their information is going to be used, you know, in the way that it needs to be. So as far as it not being abused, having safeguarding in place, ideally it going to be something that is going to benefit themselves and other people, there has to be some form of accountability for it. And the part of it that's so interesting is that there is such a high benefit rate for patients and doctors, where you could have an AI transcript of your appointment and, you know, here's a follow-up of other places to look and questions to ask without people being scared or finding it overwhelming. And the ability for that then to be something that's going to trickle down to other areas of healthcare. I say all of this with the knowledge that even getting into healthcare appointments can be such a difficult process depending on where you live and what healthcare systems are in place, but being able to maximize that time, especially if it's becoming in a disease that's going to need much future management, different teams. I now have 9 different specialists because of everything that's happened that end in ist. I've got, you know, my oncologist, I've got my neurologist, I've got my pulmonologist, all of those things where ultimately you're able to have your file that lives with you and you can say, well, here's what we found so far, and let's look at these things together and see where these strands come in to be able to have the patient care ultimately be less of a burden on the healthcare system, because hopefully answers will be found sooner, solutions can be found sooner, and from what Christine was talking about earlier, medicines can be streamlined for the patient. Wouldn't that be amazing for the next 4 generations to come?
Sounds so efficient, isn't it? You know, it's like this. But you know, the suggestions you've made, they're pretty simple. You know, I'm not, you know, and it would streamline and bring efficiency. And a lot of what we've spoken about up to this point is putting that power on the individual, but actually that, you know, in an idealist world, not everyone's going to be able to do that or do that. And you know, as we were talking earlier, it's almost like you've got to create your own audit trail of your own. We've joked about the Lever Arch files, but you almost do. You do need to do that. But actually, the professionals you're working with have that information, and you know, to your point as well, Shona, where do you go next, or where could you maybe find more information rather than sort of having to think of it off your own back as well.
And also that holistic capacity that if you were seen holistically and you did have all that data prepared and different health providers were sharing that information and had access to it, you'd potentially be able to flag these chronic diseases that are potentially coming off what the original diagnosis of, whatever it might be. And we could potentially stop that becoming a huge thing, because that can then lead to other disease down the track. So it's a kind of no-brainer, really. Like, how do we reduce it as much as possible? So I mean, I'm absolutely for the holistic thing.
Can I add in too that I think it's really important to share that information across different people, because the research that we have in different areas is different, right? And so I was able to share my genetic data with 2 different hospitals, one being in the United States, who didn't yield any really significant insights, but then was able to share it with a hospital, the City University of Hong Kong, where they were able to then link things together, but off of a different data set, right? And so I think we also have to realize that wherever we are, the information that we're seeing may not be all of the information that could apply to us.
So just to end today, we are going to pose our tween question to you today, which is, how can kids or young people help their family members when they're sick, even if they don't know a lot about medicine? Shona, shall I start with you?
Absolutely. I think the most important thing is to be yourself when you're that age. Do the things that feel right to you. Try and help out a bit more. The happiest things that my daughter has done for me in the time are the small things that would make me laugh, whether it was a drawing or she'd made up a song for me and done those parts. And the really other important part, and I was tried to be as unemotional, but I was quite emotional when we talked about it, was explaining to her at one point she felt that because I was away so much and she hadn't got to come to any of my appointments with me, and it made her very, very sad. And she was obviously quite a bit younger at the time. She was 4 and 5, but explaining to her that no, the feeling of being left out wasn't one of them. And so we included her in helping with dressings and things. But as she's getting older, and again, I had some tween nieces and nephews at the time who wanted to be updated, and so I did, and actually trust them that they could have some of the information. And I was gentle about how I did it, but I was happy for them to ask questions, and they did. And I said to them not to be worried, and we can have the questions and we can talk about it, and we'll send the updates. And yes, be inclusive, and if you'd like to know a bit more, you can ask me. But it was ultimately just being themselves, and the fun, cute things that they had done to help cheer things were really helpful. And not to get upset if one doesn't get included in everything. You can always ask questions afterwards.
Lovely. And Christine?
I love that. I had my niece when we were growing up. She actually was taught by my nurses how to give me injections. And so that was, strangely enough, fun for her at the time. A little
Is she a doctor
terrifying
now?
for me at the beginning. Not yet. But I would say, first, I would say that none of this is your fault, that there's nothing that you can do to fix this. So not to worry about the bigger picture and everything else. I think you also still have to enjoy your childhood. But I think for helping, it's really just being there, right? The most important times to me were just laying in bed, holding my niece's hand or having them next to me, and sometimes not even talking, right? Because there are periods where I was irritable and didn't want to do things, and sometimes just a little note or a little squeeze of the hand, and just being there. And I think really makes a difference, and understanding that if there are angry outbursts, that's not their feeling towards you, that there are medications that alter the way that we feel and that sometimes cause outbursts, and really just the stress of dealing with all of this is hard. So to not take personally anything that may be said to you out of anger or pain, because a lot of us deal with pain and that just becomes the thing, right? And to just like Shona said, be yourself, right? That's what I would say.
Personal touch, right? The affection and the love, and yeah, oh, so nice. Thank you. Thank you so much to Christine and Shona today for sharing your deeply personal and powerful journeys with us. Your courage and your commitment to transforming your own pain into purpose, and your passion for patient advocacy is truly inspiring. What we've heard in this conversation reminds us that advocacy isn't just a role, it's a lifeline. It's about speaking up when things go wrong, about fighting for dignity, for clarity, and for better care, not only for ourselves, but for those who come after us. At The Informed Perspective, we believe that change starts with connection. When people are empowered with information, support, and the strength of community, they can push through even the most difficult transitions and even help change the systems around them. If today's episode has sparked something in you, we invite you to keep the conversation going with your friends, your family, your local community. And if you're in a position to do so, become an advocate, not just for yourself, but for someone who may not yet have found their voice. We'll be sure to include links so you can connect with both of our amazing guests alongside the podcast recording. And as always, thank you so much for tuning in to The Informed Perspective. Until next time, stay connected, stay compassionate, and remember the power of being an active part of your community. Hashtag just give an hour. Even committing just an hour of your time in your own little way for your community can trigger positive change. Until the next time, keep informing those perspectives.